Greetings my little guzzlers. We're going to do some bread making, but actually we're going to make an ancient bread, or one that's based on an ancient bread anyway. We have previously made a medieval Egyptian bread. Well, we're going to make another ancient Egyptian bread, or probably a little bit older than the medieval, but also it's a different one. Okay, we're going to make some, I probably can't pronounce this right, Aish Baladi. Okay, so for that we're going to use Emmer wheat. Okay, and I've got 250 grams of that in there. I only want to make 4 small loaves if you like. Okay, so if you want more than that you need to double everything. But there's 250 grams of Emmer wheat. Before we do that, we want to just get preparing the yeast. So just check, got everything, and then we'll get on getting the yeast activated. So I've got 175 mils of warm water, about 35ish, and to that I'm going to add a tablespoon of honey. Okay, this would have been a standard ingredient in ancient Egypt. It's probably left a sticky mark on there. Why is it? As soon as you open honey and get any out, even though you wipe it all down, it doesn't feel sticky on the outside, guarantee it's sticky underneath. So Baladi, the second part of the name, is essentially a word meaning traditional or authentic, and Aish meant life, and that really sort of summed up the Egyptian sort of belief, if you like, that bread was the stuff of life and has been for millennia. Okay, bread was one of the most important staples in food to the ancient Egyptians, and all classes ate bread. Now there was bread and there was bread, but basically everybody, regardless of what level they were in society, would have made and eaten bread. And we know a lot about the bread from ancient Egypt simply because it's found in the tombs, paintings, and actually found in the tombs where offerings were made up, and we found the preserved loaves. Anyway, that's dissolved that in there. I'm now adding 7 grams of active yeast. Oh dear, that's cheating, but is it? We're going to talk about yeast in a minute. So I'm just going to roughly mix that into there, and then we're just going to set that to one side to let that yeast get activated. Like I said, in here we've got 250 grams of Emmer wheat, and again I'll tell you a little about Emmer wheat. The only other ingredients you're going to want is half a teaspoon of salt and a tablespoon of olive oil, and that will be it. Now we're using Emmer wheat because the ancient Egyptians almost exclusively used Emmer wheat. Even when the Romans started coming in, and the Romans brought in durum or durum wheat, Egyptians seem to stick with their Emmer wheat. Emmer wheat is a very ancient grain. It's one of the earlier forms of wheat. Now you can go into a whole thing about the biology and the genetics of wheat and modern wheat, doubling up, tripling up of chromosomes and such like. But Emmer wheat is one of the earlier varieties. Now it's quite low in gluten, so it's not much point doing a lot of kneading. Okay, but this was an important part, and not only for bread making. Emmer wheat was a tradable commodity, and the Egyptians used it as part of their economy. Now the only problem is with Emmer wheat, wheat has evolved and been selected to end up with the grains that we have today, and we thresh those, we cut the grain, we thresh it to get rid of the chaff, Well, Emmer wheat doesn't work like that. The seeds, if you like, the grains, are inside little spikelets, and thrashing them, or threshing them, sorry, doesn't really release the outer husk and chaff, if you like. So Emmer wheat or Emmer flour had to be made slightly differently. I'm not saying that's how they do it today, but back then what they would do is moisten the collected spikelets, okay, and then lightly sort of pound it in like a mortar and pestle, with a mortar and pestle, to remove that outer husk. And they were trying not to crush at this stage, you know, they're not trying to grind it up, they're just trying to get rid of that outer chaff, if you like. They would then sun dry it, winnow it, sieve it, and then they would mill it. And traditionally back then it was a saddle quern, which was basically backwards and forwards motion rather than a rotary quern. And they would grind it up, but because of all this moistening and everything else, the flour could go rancid quite quickly, and therefore you tended only to make what you needed. Right, we're going to give that yeast a little bit longer, and then we'll start assembling everything. To that flour, I'm just going to add that salt and the oil, and then we're just going to add in our activated yeast. And then all we're going to do is combine this together, and if need be we will add some more flour, okay, because we obviously want a dough. And then, just like in any other sort of bread, it's really weird actually. I don't know whether actually this Emmer wheat obviously is an Egyptian. Okay, this is a UK one, probably somewhere. In Northumberland it comes from. I'm going to have to add a little bit of flour to this. This is stone ground organic, 100% wholemeal Emmer wheat. So I've been telling you a little bit about the history of it. I'm just going to add a little bit more. If on the other hand, the flour's almost grainy. I'm not saying that's from the stone brown. That's not bits of grit, as it were. Although I should point out that the ancient Egyptians, and to be honest, most cultures who used you know, quern stones and that sort of way of, you know, making your flour, ended up with quite bad tooth decay, because you would end up with little bits of grit in your flour, which would end up being in the bread or whatever you made, and of course repeated sort of crunching down wore away your tooth enamel. Right, I think it's a little bit sticky, but I think at this stage what we're going to do is I'm just going to remove this, and I'm just going to lightly oil the bowl. I'm not getting a clean bowl just to oil that and get two bowls dirty, so I've just greased that dirty bowl. We put that in there, and now I'm just going to cover this, and we're now going to put it to one side for 2 hours to let it rise. While it's doing that, tell you a little bit more about the yeast. Now, I said to you, was we really wrong in using that active yeast? Well, we were and we weren't. Now, almost certainly, and also actually there's a bit of debate as to whether the Egyptians would have used yeast, to be honest. Some scholars believe that bread was unleavened, just as you get unleavened pita breads or pita type breads in Egypt today. But others say that, well, actually they did make bread with some form of leavening, and there's evidence that they did. Now, yeast would have been obtained from wild yeasts that, you know, floating around in the air, that you find in the water, and cultivation of these yeasts you know, go back millennia. I like the word millennia today, don't I? And something appeared because I've had her out the back in the conservatory to keep her warm. Here's Scully. Okay, Scully is a sour dough starter that I started almost a week ago. Yeah, actually a week ago, 20th. It's not quite ready yet, and this recipe was done with active yeast, not with sourdough. We're going to be making some using Scully in a later episode, but she's busy fermenting away well there. And essentially, all they did was allow these wild yeasts and bacteria that were in the air and in the flour and other things to ferment, which obviously that meant they reproduced, they produced more, and they could then use that, just as you would use a sourdough starter, to make leavened bread as such. Now, we know they made beer. They made lots of beer, they like their beer. And that would have probably been fermented initially using wild yeast, but then they learned how they could collect either the scum of yeast that formed on top, and this is an interesting thing actually about beer and yeast. You get top yeast and bottom yeast. So a top yeast, actually, as it ferments and finishes fermenting, it comes to the top and sits on the top of the beer, and you can then almost like scrape it off. Then you get bottom yeast, which sink to the bottom, and you just draw the beer off the top, leaving that yeast behind. But anyway, that's going off tangent. So they could collect yeast that way, but also they could use bread to provide the yeast for their beer. What they would do is, obviously they need some yeast to start with to make their bread, but then they would take that bread and the Sumatrans, or is it Sumatrans? I think it's the Sumatrans or Sumerians anyway. They used a similar method where they would sort of effectively dry that bread, and then they could crumble it up. They wanted to heat it, dry it out, but without killing the yeast. And then they would crumble it up, and then they could add that to their next batch of bread or beer to release the yeast into that, to allow the fermentation to happen. So in a way, a form of dried active yeast. This was cheating, this was just actual yeast that was dried. So we put together the basic ingredients that were used by the ancient Egyptians and we use today, and we're now just going to leave this, like I say, for 2 hours. Now at the end of that 2 hours we want to get our oven on, ready to heat it, about 200 centigrade in a fan oven, 220 if it's not a fan oven. So a bit near the end of that time we'll put that on, put the oven on, and I'm just going to move my dough out to the conservatory where it's a bit warmer, and then we'll finish up our history lesson when we come to make the bread. Remember, there's not an awful lot of gluten, like I said to you, in Emmer wheat, and so therefore you're not going to get the same sort of rise. Okay, so all I'm doing is just knocking it back a little bit, shaping it up, and basically we're after making small loaves. Now we know that they had some quite elaborate shapes for their flowers, for their breads. They were often in the shape of figures. They could be human, animal, they could be geometric shapes, just plain round shapes, fan shapes, anything really. But what we're going to do at this stage is we're just going to cut this up. Like I said to you, we're making these in 4 small loaves, if you like. So I'm just going to round these up. Not quite the same size, but there you go, don't matter. and then we're just going to leave them covered over for about 10 minutes. I haven't put my oven on yet. I should do that once I've got these covered and ready to go. And like I said, you want to put your oven on, if it's a fan oven, at 200, 220 if it's not a fan. So I'm just going to set a little timer there for 10 minutes. So I've been talking about we're using Emmer wheat. They also grew barley, and that's part of the reason we know about, you know, the beer making. Well, it's not the reason we know about the beer making, but they use the barley for beer making. They did also use it to make bread. They used lily seeds and lily roots, which were dried and ground up to make a flour for bread, and also tiger nut. Again, that was made into a flour and used to bake bread. Now, I've said to you that we know about these shapes mainly from tomb paintings. The nobility often would have a much finer flour. They get it ground that little bit, you know, finer, and for that they would make more fancy breads and cakes. And on special days, or on special occasions, these breads would be, wouldn't say decorated, they would be enhanced with coriander seeds, fruit, dates, perhaps mix some other grains in there to enhance the flavour. Now we're going to cook these on baking trays in the oven. Okay, we know that there was effectively 3 ways in which they used to bake, which sort of evolved through the history of the ancient Egyptians. So the Old Kingdom, they made these heavy pottery moulds that they would fill with dough, and then they set them into the ashes of the fires and bake them that way. Then we moved to the Middle Kingdom, where they made these tall cones sat on square hearths, and in the New Kingdom they made these large open-topped clay ovens, which were cylindrical, and a bit like tandoori bread, the loaves ready for cooking were slapped onto the side of the oven, and so when they're baked properly they would fall off and you'd know they were done. So this recipe we've used, the earliest recipe that is known came from the wall of Senet's tomb in Luxor. Now he or she or whoever wrote this, his original instructions were to crush the grain with sticks, hence what I said originally about we need to separate off the chaff, and then using a grindstone crush the grain still finer until you have a heap of white flour. This is wholemeal, hence it's got that sort of yellowy browny colour. Whether that was their version of white, I don't know, but there we go. So I'm just going to get the oven on, and then we'll get ready for final shaping and baking. We take our dough after 10 minutes, and then all I'm going to do is just roll them out to a rough circular shape, and then we're going to place them on the baking tray, and then once we've got all them done, they'll go in the oven. Now they want to go for about 20 minutes, but after about halfway through, about 10 minutes, you might want to turn the tray round, make sure it gets evenly baked. This had about 18 minutes. Okay, you can see it hasn't risen much. I said to you it won't do. The nature of the flour, very low gluten content. You're not going to get the same sort of rise that you'll get with normal bread. Now, you need to let this cool a little bit, but it is nicer if you eat it when it's warm. Okay, and you can have it just with, well, drizzled with a bit of olive oil. I've actually baked this to go with a medieval Egyptian dish, which we'll be having later, i.e. tomorrow. So I might, before we serve it up, I might just gently warm these in the oven. But we'll let these cool for a little bit and we'll have a little taster. Alright, so not that you can really see much there. You can see it's got a little bit of a sort of bready structure to it, but not an awful lot. Quite nutty. I don't know if that's the Emmer wheat. Bit of a crunch around the outside there. I think that one's slightly too much. Same as that one there. Some of these are rolled slightly thicker and they are much more sort of spongy, if you like a bread. But interesting taste. In a way, I suppose it's almost reminiscent a little bit of sort of toast. A bit thicker in the middle one. But this is going to be used to accompany a dish where effectively you can use this, I wouldn't say like a plate, but more like a spoon, perhaps a little bit more like the way they would use, you know, bread in other cultures to eat with your fingers, if that. So there you go. There it is. Well, that was a version of an ancient Egyptian bread, Aish Baladi. Bread of life. That's not what that means. I told you at the beginning what it means. But it's essentially, that's what it stands for. Bread of life. There you go.